Good afternoon and welcome to Juniper Research's Top 10 Tech and Telco presentations for 2022 webinar. I'm James Moore, Head of Consulting here at Juniper Research. With me today are Scarlett Woodford, Senior Analyst, and Adam Weirs, a Research Analyst. Before we talk you through our top 10 tech predictions for 2022, we'll be assessing the results of some of the predictions that we made for 2021. To begin with, a brief introduction to Juniper Research and our top 10 tech and telco trends for 2022. Juniper Research specializes in identifying and appraising new high growth market sectors within the digital ecosystem. We provide market research content across 50 technology markets, and these research reports form the basis from which our analysts make these predictions. Now, for the past 10 years, we've been bringing out a set of end-of-year predictions in which we look at key technologies, devices, and services that we expect to have a disruptive impact in the next year. We look at what legislative changes are planned, future products in development, and which technologies are anticipated to be front and center at key industry showcases like CES and Mobile World Congress. We also speak to industry movers and shakers across a wide variety of verticals to discuss their opinions on any upcoming announcements or expected developments over the coming year. Our analyst team then whittles down a long list of possibles into a shorter list of probables, which are then ranked on their likely overall impact in 2022 to give us our set of top predictions for the next 12 months. Over the course of the webinar, we'll go through each of the trends, outlining 4 key aspects: what the opportunity is, why this will be happening in 2022, who will benefit, and lastly, what do we predict will happen. For this year, we've returned to our usual format consisting of 10 trends that we expect to occur in 2022 after the unprecedented disruption caused by COVID-19 last year, which caused us to change format, looking at 4 mega trends and then looking at niche areas and predictions under those umbrellas. And where relevant, we've also included the title of existing Juniper Research reports in the area in question on the second slide of each trend. Before we go through this year's predictions, I'd like to just take a quick look through our predictions for 2021. The pandemic has had a severe impact on all technology markets, and many of our previous predictions were centered around the digital transformation that was accelerated by the pandemic. Our first megatrend last year was a greater impact from AI in the midst of the pandemic. Whilst extended reality has not experienced the traction that we predicted it would, technologies such as chatbots and blockchain certainly saw a faster than anticipated rollout this year. Remote solutions were undeniably important over the last 12 months, and there have been virtual workspace announcements. However, hardware requirements are limiting uptake in commercial settings. Additionally, multi-service subscriptions and eSIM remote tools have certainly seen more adoption during the pandemic. Health has also been a central topic over the last year, and increased focus on digital therapeutics and wearables have been widely discussed. However, we did miss the mark on the adoption of sex tech devices. Lastly, the development of intelligent connectivity is a trend that we continue to witness today, where the development of private networks, standalone 5G, and confidential computing are as relevant as ever. So with that, all that said about what's been going on this year, what's going to happen next year? So without any further delay, I will begin by introducing our first top 10 trend for 2022, which is that 5G capabilities will drive the adoption of private networks. We've seen private cellular networks have a strong adoption over 2021, with thousands of new networks being established. These are networks that only allow specific authorized devices to connect, rather than being publicly accessible, which allows data traffic to be more closely controlled, as well as adding an additional layer of security into the network. Many of these are using 5G technologies, and we expect this to accelerate in 2022. This will be driven by 5G features far more than the raw speed of 5G. Network slicing and guaranteed levels of coverage and low latency will be key among those features, as well as more flexible and hardware agnostic architecture. These features are far more useful for private networks than the raw increase and speed that 5G will bring. These features will include being able to deploy networks in environments that other forms of connectivity struggle with, such as environments with lots of metal, allowing more companies to leverage private networks in a variety of hostile environments, such as offshore platforms and remote areas, which is also driving this trend. 5G has been one of the primary drivers for interest in private networks, bringing awareness of private networks up, despite private 4G LTE networks having been around for several years. And our recent report on private networks shows the degree to which 5G networks will be a core part of these, with 5G networks rapidly rolling out as the first private networks that many businesses are deploying. With several features of 5G networks being promoted as enterprise first in a way that 4G networks never were, this is driving up part of the interest for 5G for enterprise connectivity, and it's building faster for the new standard than any other cellular standard before it. With specialist devices and networks present in many industries, private networks will be a vital part of the 5G future as well. The regulatory landscape is more supportive of 5G private networks in 2022 than it has been in recent years, with several countries set to allocate spectrum for 5G in the next year, which can then be leveraged for private networks, as well as several frameworks for private networks coming into place. While 5G spectrum has been available for private network use in some countries from late 2020, a third wave of countries is due to assign spectrum in 2022, which will bring these technologies to countries like India, Turkey, and many parts of the Middle East and Africa. This, coupled with an increasing range of hardware that supports 5G deployment from network vendors and device manufacturers, this means that 2022 will see a large number of rollouts of private networks, both in these regions and globally, particularly those that focus on industries like mining and energy. Now, we expect the adoption of 5G private networks to benefit a large array of stakeholders. Enterprises will be able to leverage extended and accelerated connectivity, which will allow for greater efficiency in their operations, including automation in many cases. In particular, we are expecting adoption from the industrial sector for more flexible manufacturing, connected offshore operations, and an extension of connectivity into mining operations. Healthcare will also benefit, as these will allow the adoption of more data-intensive technologies like surgical robotics, as well as giving an additional layer of security by limiting what devices can access networks holding confidential healthcare data. This will bring the global total of private networks deployed to over 48,000 by the end of 2022. The precise revenue opportunities for this in each of the verticals are given in our private networks research, although we expect the majority of deployments to be in North America, as this graphic shows you. Network hardware vendors will have a broader range of potential clients through the use of private networks, and also the ability to assume the role of network manager, which isn't necessarily a role that they have historically played in deployments of public networks. These have been dominated by large network operators in the past, and we also anticipate a number of technology integrators and smaller network operators to take the opportunity to establish themselves as private network providers in a way that's not been previously possible in the realm of public connectivity. We've already seen some signs of this in the allocation of spectrum in Germany and the success of Nokia, Citymesh, and other non-traditional operators leading the development of private network operation in ports throughout Europe. However, such initiatives will often remain bound by national restrictions based on spectrum, meaning that many of these new players will remain limited to the territories where they've been able to secure spectrum arrangements, either with governments or spectrum owners. And now we come to our first poll question of the webinar, which is on the benefits of 5G. We would like to know your thoughts on which sectors do you think that will benefit the most from 5G connectivity, and we're choosing between logistics, manufacturing, mining, oil and gas, and smart city solutions. Thank you very much for those of you who have voted, and I think we're now due to go through and see the results. We've got a majority of people thinking that smart city solutions will be one of the core things benefiting private networks and 5G connectivity. Smart city solutions will have a wide range of use cases for private 5G connectivity, everything from ensuring a continuity of service for emergency services through to some instances of provision for fixed wireless access for residents and so on. With this particular solution, we've already seen this happen to quite a large degree in North America, particularly where schools are concerned. They've been rolling out these sorts of networks to make sure there's been a continuity of education, and so this sort of infrastructure is very much already in place. So I would expect this sort of thing to happen more in North America than anywhere else, because there's that infrastructure already evolving. And now we're moving on to our next trend, which is that video game subscriptions will consolidate in order to focus on content. The past year has seen subscription-based video game services become a key part of the distribution landscape for video games, with our research showing that this will be a vital part and an industry that we're expecting to be worth $273 billion next year, in dollars, that is. The success of Microsoft's Game Pass and PlayStation's PS Now services are the most obvious examples of the subscription services doing well, but many major games publishers are also providing subscription services as a way to access their content. These are being promoted by the video games industry because they offer recurring revenue for access, as well as the games themselves being a potential portal for further in-app spending. Like the video streaming platforms before them, however, we anticipate that these platforms will drive consolidation in the video games industry in 2022. Large games publishers have always acquired smaller developers to enhance their own offerings, but the ability to offer popular games as exclusives for a subscription service through their own platforms will accelerate this trend. The nature of content platforms and the need for them to have content variety and potentially more content than any single user could consume to allow some variety between choices has also intensified this need for more content, which with companies potentially drawing criticism and potentially losing subscribers if they don't keep up a large volume of content. This is something that we've seen when we've looked at digital video, and we're expecting it to be the same with regards to video game subscriptions. New content in the video game industry is also a strong marketing opportunity, giving companies more ways to promote their content to new audiences, such as bringing in fans of acquired studios into the services and so on offered by the acquirer. 2022 will be a vital year for these platforms as the world begins to open up again. The COVID-19 pandemic has allowed them to expand as other ways to spend leisure time have been less available. But the relaxing of restrictions and rising inflation in many markets means that retaining subscribers will become harder, and increased competition among platform providers. And because of that increased competition, publishers and other platform providers will be keen to make their offerings more compelling in order to retain subscribers. And for bigger publishers, the acquisition of smaller developers who make popular games is a quick and easy way to do this, and something that's been very much a historical trend, as you can see with the acquisitions that have been made by game studios in the past on the right here. Microsoft has been particularly aggressive in this area lately, with the acquisition of ZeniMax Media adding several titles to its Game Pass library, as well as having them establish compatibility with EA Play as part of the Game Pass service. Other publishers will need to offer similarly broad services quite rapidly in order to compete successfully with Game Pass in that area. We expect that smaller developers will benefit from this trend, as acquisition will give them a sound financial basis, or at least a more sound financial basis, from which to grow their offerings and develop new and interesting products. We also believe this is not likely to fall victim to the typical problems associated with such acquisitions, with engagement being the only real requirement for games intended to be part of a subscription service. This should allow developers to focus on producing unique content rather than generating revenue through in-game mechanisms, or having to follow a particular formula that traditional revenue models from large studios would otherwise dictate. The biggest beneficiaries on the publisher's side will be those that have their own hardware and can thereby retain users completely within a single ecosystem much more easily and provide smoother experiences than their software-only competitors. The early winners in this market have been Microsoft and Sony, and they follow this pattern. We do not expect other players to disrupt this to any great degree because of that hardware and software integration that's available for PlayStation and PC and Xbox ecosystems. Google Stadia has attempted something like this with its own content studios, but those have ceased operation, which means that they won't gain those same benefits. Because of this lock-in effect, many of the acquired companies will struggle to make an impact outside of these platforms, and that exclusivity will be the defining feature for many of these titles and companies that are acquired. As a result, many of these platform subscriptions will ultimately be driven by tentpole game launches, and customers' loyalties will change to other platforms when different studios release key games through them. There will be exceptions to this where partnerships can be agreed and the access to many popular titles broadened, such as that between EA and Microsoft for EA Play access via Game Pass, but those will be very much in the minority. I'm now going to hand over to Scarlett as we look at trend number 8.
Thanks, James. The next trend we're going to look at is the streaming platforms to capitalise on the rise of eSports. We define eSports as competitive video gaming. And whilst it usually occurs through organised multiplayer competitions at professional level, eSports is also growing amongst amateur gamers. We believe that the COVID-19 pandemic heightened consumer awareness of eSports, enabling this form of digital entertainment to gain a cultural foothold. At a time when national stay-at-home orders and government-enforced lockdowns were in place within some countries, and official fixtures were cancelled by professional sporting leagues, eSports provided the entertainment offered by spectator sports, whilst also adding an additional interactive element. This increase in viewership has boosted audience numbers and revenues for streaming platforms that host eSports events, making it a vital part of platform providers' streaming businesses. We anticipate that the popularity of eSports will continue into 2022, with a series of high-profile eSports events scheduled for next year, including the Premier League, the 4th season of the Formula 1 eSports series, and the inclusion of eSports at the Asian Games. Notably, there are also growing numbers of virtual leagues that are being created in tandem with existing real-world sports leagues, such as German professional football and the virtual Bundesliga. These events will work to promote the public visibility of eSports, which will expand the following of these fixtures and work to broaden audience demographics. We believe that online streaming will remain the core means of eSports content consumption in 2022, with major platforms such as Twitch and YouTube being used alongside social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook for additional promotion. Having said that, we expect Facebook to have an advantage as this element increases, with the ability to integrate streaming and social media sharing, although their currently small market share will make this growth slow. The monetization of eSports will primarily focus around subscription-based models, such as subscribing to a particular channel or event, or pay-per-view models, in which viewers are able to buy a digital ticket to virtual events. As eSports establishes itself as a competitive sport in its own right, players will attract more prominent brand endorsements, vendor partnerships, and game publishing collaborations, really drawing further parallels with professional sporting leagues. We believe that professional gamers can strengthen their online presence by creating profiles on emerging social media platforms, such as TikTok, in order to promote eSports events to younger audiences and really capitalise on the trend of influencer marketing. Streaming platform providers will also benefit from collaborations between professional gamers and larger brands, with high-profile eSports events attracting greater volumes of traffic to streaming platforms. Therefore, the establishment of eSports sponsorships and brand partnerships will increase revenues for both the broadcasting platforms and the competitive gamers involved. In our eSports and game streaming research, we forecast the global eSports and game streaming industry will be worth $3.5 billion by 2025, rising from $2.1 billion in 2021, representing a growth of 70% over the next 4 years. In response, we anticipate that game publishers will accelerate investment into the development of video games that are really designed to support organised multiplayer competitions on both an individual and a team-based level. Countries with tighter eSports restrictions will witness a loosening of these restrictions, whereas other markets will expand state-sponsored growth initiatives to make eSports a really dominant industry that can contribute to national GDP. We note that streaming rights to eSports have not seen much in the way of development to date, and the crucial issue here is quality and audience. The majority of tournaments are shown on Twitch simply because it is seen as providing really the best quality environment in which to offer such media. However, much like traditional sports, such as football's Premier League, we expect that eSports leagues will see battles fought over content rights and ownership, with the industry set to see valuations in millions of dollars. Having said that, I'll now hand over to Adam to discuss our next trend.
Thank you, Scarlett. I'd like to begin this afternoon by talking about smart grids. In recent weeks, there have been a number of high-profile discussions regarding energy, sustainability, and the environment. And as time goes on, these discussions are set to only become more louder and more pressing. In this context, smart grids are an important technology. A smart grid is a traditional utility grid that has been augmented with analytics and connected devices to improve efficiency, with the end goal of reducing costs and energy usage. By comparison, a traditional energy grid typically involves large power plants and centralized networks, providing no real role for analytics. This, as a result, restricts the grid's ability to cope with new energy sources. Smart grid systems, however, fundamentally change this equation. They can handle smaller scale renewables, decentralized grids, provide a more active role for end users and allowing them to monitor their energy usage, and offer the potential advanced data analytics. Ultimately, the trend we believe will happen in 2022 is that investment into these platforms will grow as utility companies and governments seek out more efficient grid systems, particularly utility companies who have been left financially exposed in recent months by major fluctuations in wholesale gas and electricity prices. It is imperative, therefore, that utility companies lower their costs, while at the same time continue to provide a reliable service to end users. Smart grids are a concrete means by which they can achieve this, and over the next year, we expect investment in these platforms to accelerate as environmental and industry pressures intensify. However, this will require significant pressure from regulators to achieve. Regulators have a large role in how utility grids function, and buy-in from these stakeholders will be key to driving adoption. The biggest beneficiaries will be those companies that roll out smart grids quickly. For utility companies, it is all about making operational savings and increasing the ability of the networks to cope with the changing landscape. By investing in smart grid systems, they can leverage this new technology to really revitalize their business models in a way that will be highly valuable and highly profitable. Regulators and governments will also benefit significantly. Smart grids are an important step in achieving decarbonisation. Therefore, smart grid rollouts will enable these bodies to meet their climate goals, which, given recent discourse regarding energy usage and sustainability, are likely to be heavily scrutinised going forward. Consumers will also be major beneficiaries. Ultimately, in order to achieve smart grid goals, this means making data around energy usage available to end users, which in turn will enable them to make much more informed choices regarding their energy consumption. They will also benefit in the long term from reduced environmental impact, as well as potentially more affordable energy prices. However, this will take some time to realise. Utility grids are complex, and infrastructure products can take a long time to deliver, meaning that while we anticipate smart grid deployments to be accelerated in the coming year, it may in fact take several years for the full benefits to be felt by users and utility companies alike. So then, what is likely to happen in 2022? We are predicting that smart grid deployments will accelerate rapidly as utility companies seek to build networks that are fit for purpose. This will result in a lot of partnerships and announcements on network improvements, providing a major opportunity for smart grid vendors to win multi-year contracts for network transformation. Indeed, our recent smart grid research indicates that once these initiatives are realised, we will witness energy savings of over 1,000 terawatt hours in 2026, the equivalent of powering over 42 million soccer matches at Wembley Stadium. The increased use of analytics, demand responsiveness, and energy storage will also be critical as energy networks transform from reactive vessels to bodies that are able to accurately anticipate and meet the needs of end users, and by doing so, create the low carbon future that we require. Now, from energy to edge computing and its applications in the delivery of intelligent healthcare. The development of centralized cloud servers led operators and enterprises to assume that these technologies would play a pivotal role in not only storing, but processing and analyzing the significant amounts of data generated by IoT devices. However, as demand for these services has grown, so too has the realization that the cloud is an unsuitable medium for data-intensive computing activities, particularly in real-world settings where bandwidth congestion, network reliability, and latency issues can be incredibly disruptive, if not highly dangerous. Enter edge computing. Edge computing is a form of distributed computing that enables computationally intensive activities such as data analysis to be undertaken not at a remote cloud storage facility, but at a location closer to the end user. By arranging these networks in this way, enterprises can benefit from significant reductions in latency and lag, enabling effective, efficient connections for use cases where real-time analysis delivery is a necessity, such as connected vehicles, industrial centres, and pertinently to us, healthcare. We believe that 2022 is the year where the use of edge computing in healthcare settings will move from pilot tests and small-scale deployments to becoming a vital element of future healthcare delivery, especially in three use cases: remote monitoring, connected ambulances, and surgical robotics. These technologies generate significant quantities of data, which, as we discussed, can become disrupted or distorted, resulting in significant risk to patients. The ultra-low latency afforded by edge computing, however, reduces this risk, improving workflows and enabling clinicians to focus on delivering the best possible patient care. As edge computing becomes more integrated in healthcare, there will be considerable benefits for a range of stakeholders. By deploying edge computing, healthcare providers, for instance, will not only benefit from enhanced services and improved care quality and delivery, but be able to deploy additional services without worrying about network strain or latency, including emergency services such as connected ambulances, asset tracking, advanced computer-aided diagnostics, and ultimately, smart hospitals. These are hospital facilities that leverage the latest advances in devices and analytics to optimize every aspect of their operational performance, from care delivery and staff productivity to resource management and operational expenditures. Smart hospitals will be a major aspect of future healthcare delivery around the world, a market that our research indicates will go from $29 billion in 2021 to over $59 billion by 2026. The services enabled by edge computing, remote monitoring, connected ambulance, surgical robotics, as well as machine learning will be vital to driving the significant growth. There will also be obvious benefits for consumers. In addition to benefiting from a better standard of care, edge computing enables consumers to participate in an emerging healthcare delivery model that prioritizes proactive diagnosis, the identifying, managing, and mitigating of health conditions before they require serious medical intervention. This is opposed to the reactive model that is currently used in many healthcare settings that favors medical intervention only as and when required. The advent of edge computing within healthcare also presents an opportunity for network operators to place themselves firmly within the value chain for this emerging healthcare model. Technologies such as connected ambulances and at-home remote monitoring will depend on network operators enabling nodes at the edge of the networks, which presents a new wealth of revenue opportunities. And really, that's what we're going to see over the next few years. Healthcare device vendors building partnerships with stakeholders such as network operators to build out these integrations and enable these systems to be deployed in healthcare settings and begin revolutionizing healthcare delivery. However, it is likely that this rollout will not occur simultaneously around the world, owing to these systems' reliance on connected devices and robust technical infrastructure. As such, deployment of edge computing with healthcare is likely to be restricted to developed regions for the time being, with deployments in developing regions occurring in the long term. Now, returning to the topic of sustainability, let's talk about electric vehicles. The last few years have seen the beginnings of a revolution with mobility, particularly with regards to electric vehicles, which are beginning to become popular with end users. A major contributing factor to this adoption has been government incentives, particularly in countries such as Norway, where drivers can readily access grants to purchase electric vehicles. Of course, where there is an increase in electric vehicles, there is an increase in the number of electric vehicle charging stations. As such, the last several years have seen a strong uptick in the number of EV stations in service, as well as the development of an active competitive vendor market. However, this market is rife with fragmentation, from charging plugs and charging rates to access methods and access charges. The layer of fragmentation within this market makes owning and operating an electric vehicle a complicated user proposition, which in turn acts as an anchor on adoption. We anticipate that 2022 will be the year where these barriers start to break down. Critically, we will begin to see interoperability between charging networks become a more pronounced feature of the market, making the user journey far easier. Ultimately, we're reaching a point in electric vehicle adoption where public charging must improve. The number of electric vehicles in service is becoming higher, and the barriers must break down between providers to correctly serve these vehicles. There are indeed already signs that interoperability is beginning to emerge. Tesla is opening up its supercharging networks to charging of third-party vehicles, with a pilot program currently underway in the Netherlands. On top of this, we've begun to see the emergence of vehicle manufacturer-led charging networks, typically apps which aggregate different charging points, the primary example being Kia Charge. So, we've heard what the changes will be in this market, but who will actually benefit from these shifts? The biggest winners from this trend will be the end users themselves. Interoperable charging means they will have better, more comprehensive charging network options. making electric vehicle ownership more viable and more manageable on a day-to-day and long-term basis. By offering apps and services that aggregate different charging networks, vehicle manufacturers will gain a greater loyalty in the charging market, providing additional revenue to them and possible customer loyalty benefits. It also makes them more likely to be able to sell electric vehicles. Current concerns around charging limits their prospects, whereas if manufacturers can ensure that they have much better charging options, they will reap the benefits in terms of sales. Gaining more control will be of greater importance to manufacturers, as the need to charge batteries at faster charging stations increases as vehicle range increases. Charging networks will also benefit from these changes. By boosting interoperability, they will gain access to customers that they did not already work with, widening their reach. While they may not own the customer relationship, their branding will still be on the charging point, and they can attract customers by making points better for faster charging or rolling them out to better locations. Governments will be the last main beneficiary. Many governments have very aggressive climate targets to market, which includes commitments to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles, replacing them with electric vehicles. By resolving these issues with charging, it will be easier for them to meet these targets. So, to conclude, let's recap. What is our prediction here? We believe that in 2022, we will see more charging networks enabling interoperability and working to develop common ways to access and pay services. This will significantly enhance the user proposition for operating an electric vehicle and will set up the market for future growth. Our recent electric vehicles charging research found that these changes will enable charging sessions to exceed 1.5 billion globally by 2026. We also believe that in resolving this, vehicle manufacturers will play a much bigger role in the market, which will fundamentally alter the charging network, and this will have many repercussions over the coming years. We now come to our next poll question, which is, do you think that electric vehicle charging points will become significantly more interoperable in 2022? We have a variety of options on screen now with varying degrees of likeliness. I think ultimately this will come down to optimism, whether you believe that vendors will look towards these more long-term goals of enabling interoperability or market forces will win out. So I believe the results are coming in now. Let's just take a look at what the verdict was. And the majority believe that interoperability is quite likely in 2022, which, yeah, that's certainly achievable. As we've discussed, we have interoperability already emerging, and we have more solid commitments from manufacturers towards enabling interoperability going forward. Now, I'd like to pass you back to my colleague Scarlett for the next trend.
Thanks, Adam. We predict that flash calling will disrupt operators' business messaging revenue. We define flash calling as an authentication process that leverages mobile voice networks to authenticate users or actions, which brands and enterprises can use to authenticate areas of client interactions. During the flash calling process, a missed call is placed, with the incoming number acting as the one-time password, which can be processed automatically. We anticipate that best practices for identity authentication will call for the use of two-factor authentication, which requires a mobile channel. Whilst SMS will remain the most popular channel for identity authentication during 2022, flash calling offers notable benefits above operator business messaging. For example, flash calling offers a level of simplicity that operator business messaging simply cannot match. Whilst traditional authentication services, such as A2P SMS, require users to enter a password or a passcode, flash calling is a much more passive user process, as it does not require any further input from the user over the majority of devices. This is because the call is connected and immediately disconnected in most cases. However, in some instances, the user may require information from the phone number itself in order to input this into a third-party platform. However, it's important to note the A number from the flash calling service provider is used as the authentication code, which can be done automatically over most smartphones. Importantly, whilst a number of OTT application players have launched OTT-based flash calling services, these applications really suffer from a significant degree of regional fragmentation. As a result, larger brands and enterprises who operate on an international basis will really continue to favour operator-led services, such as A2P SMS and operator business messaging, in order to standardise the authentication process and procedure across geographies. Whilst OTT messaging-based flash calling services will be limited to small and medium enterprises who operate on a national basis, the aggregated demand from this level of enterprise represents a substantial revenue opportunity for messaging app providers. So then, who will benefit? So brands and enterprises are constantly looking for cheaper ways to authenticate users, as whilst the costs associated with sending individual operator-led business messages are minimal, the aggregated cost of sending large volumes of traffic is substantial. On the other hand, non-terminated voice calls are currently unmonetized or are monetized at a very low rate by operators and therefore offer a much cheaper alternative to traditional operator-led business messages. We believe that the simplicity of flash calling will lead to a decrease in the number of operator business messages sent as enterprises look for more cost-effective ways of communicating with their customers. This will directly impact operator business messaging revenue, as the volume of messages operators can charge for will decrease, alongside an increase in the number of non-monetized flash calls terminated on the network. In our recent flash calling authentication report, we forecast that the global number of flash calling API calls will reach 69 million by the end of 2021. As a result of this, operators will really look to effectively monetize flash calling services, removing the unique selling point of a no-cost or low-cost service for enterprises. For this very reason, we believe that future enterprise adoption of flash calling services will depend on the effective promotion of the other benefits that flash calling services can offer, such as reducing user input and offering a more passive user authentication process. The reduction of user input will diminish the probability of user error, which is beneficial for brands and enterprises, as ultimately user error can lead to further user dissatisfaction with the authentication services implemented. Now we move on to the top 3 most influential trends for next year, starting with the disruption of the roaming market caused by 5G and the IoT. This disruption is coming from the fact that 5G networks and roaming IoT connections will necessitate the entrance of new market stakeholders that are really responsible for the rise in IoT roaming data. We have seen similar processes happening for voice and SMS roaming in the past. Voice roaming, for example, required massive infrastructure investment to enable a level of cooperation between operators on an unprecedented scale, which would eventually lead to the roaming wholesale market as we know it. SMS roaming was largely driven by the rise of the business messaging market in the 1990s, when international termination for SMS was required and there was no regulation in place. This was a progression of the market and further operator cooperation was required, which led to the emergence of roaming vendors that provided services able to standardise the billing and payments process between operators. So the next logical question would be, what is next for roaming? Well, we believe that the answer is data roaming. For both SMS and voice roaming, the demand was driven by the requirement for a single vendor, and the increasing demand for IoT roaming data is doing the same thing now. Operators have invested in core IoT networks, as enterprises would rather have a relationship with a single operator rather than multiple operators. In turn, they could benefit from the pre-existing roaming agreements for global connectivity. However, these roaming vendors are not entirely equipped to handle the complexities and the dynamic nature of the future of IoT roaming. The biggest hurdle for mobile data was that a SIM card could not have a new profile loaded onto it, and changing services to a new provider required a new SIM card to be installed. The eSIM has changed this, and now a SIM can be reprovisioned remotely. So why do we think things are going to change in 2022? Well, as previously mentioned, 5G connectivity is on the rise, and IoT users are beginning to partner with a single operator for roaming connectivity. With the greater capabilities of 5G, we expect an increase in the number of 5G roaming connections, which will place further strain on incumbent roaming vendors. There is an opportunity here for new entrants to capitalise on this demand for better roaming services, and we've already seen a number of acquisitions in this space, starting with Cisco's acquisition of Jasper a few years ago. But who will benefit from this trend? Well, firstly, roaming vendors who will capitalise on the rise of roaming IoT connections will gain the additional revenue from IoT connectivity. To the right, you can see just how much data is expected to be generated by IoT roaming connections next year. One of the key drivers behind the future rise in this figure is the launch of 5G networks and the rise in 5G roaming connections. As the number of devices available continues to increase, we expect a greater number of these to be permanently roaming owing to new roaming agreements. And whilst the growth in the number of IoT devices arguably represents a lucrative revenue opportunity for operators, there is also the potential for issues to arise. That is, with IoT devices capable of permanently roaming and demonstrating that permanent roaming behaviour, operators must ensure that connected devices do not impact network capacity, signalling capabilities, or processing power. Using standalone networks, operators will benefit from new insights that enable the identification and analysis of connected devices, allowing for enhanced network control. It's therefore important for operators to implement dedicated 5G roaming agreements that can handle this type of roaming behaviour. However, as the cost to carry IoT data across multiple operator networks increases, so too will the demands from IoT users. And at present, roaming vendors are not well prepared to deal with this. As a result, we are seeing more and more CSPs, or communication service providers, emerge to provide these data roaming services that are in demand. Due to the growth in the number of connected devices and sensors, it is really important for operators to implement dedicated IoT roaming agreements in order to ensure the effective monetization of device traffic. Having said this, we expect the transition of IoT devices to 5G networks will be gradual. Whilst only a limited number of IoT use cases require roaming capabilities, these applications will require the level of service that can only be realised from 5G standalone networks. The ability to support blended traffic in terms of both 4G and 5G traffic will remain crucial in the current mixed roaming environment that includes both standalone and non-standalone infrastructure. And now I'll hand back to James for our penultimate trend for 2022.
Thank you, Scarlett. Our last trend is that the supply chains will utilise advanced technologies to increase their resilience. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought many companies and work practices into the digital ecosystem in ways that they really haven't been before, and this has left many companies exposed to severe supply chain problems, in particular lack of assessment of third-party capabilities, as the strains imposed by the pandemic have caused severe supply chain uncertainty, as well as involving a wide range of digital third-party providers who haven't been able to ensure their security. This is particularly acute in the case of the semiconductor shortage, which has impacted many different industries, from white goods providers to automotive manufacturers. And in addition, the increasingly digital nature of much of the supply chain and its reliance on potentially insecure software has come into sharp focus, particularly following the SolarWinds cyber attack. The ability to be vulnerable to cyber attack because of a supplier's insecure practices is a real threat, with which many companies will move to remedy in 2022, following a large shift towards digital in all industries. The digitization of supply chains and this inherent complexity means that 2022 will see companies reaching for security solutions to help manage these issues, leveraging a number of technologies to increase their resilience and the resilience of their supply chain, particularly the ability of third-party suppliers to withstand various operating stresses and the potentials for cybersecurity attacks. This is driven by learnings from the pandemic, as well as several legislative and governmental pressures. IoT supply chain solutions backed by the blockchain have already been gaining traction in several sectors, most notably agriculture and food, but these will see further expansion as the precariousness of the global supply chain has become more apparent. Following an executive order from the US president and similar actions in other countries, we expect 2022 to see an increasing focus on software supply chains to enhance cybersecurity. In the US, after the deadlines for initial consultations on these initiatives have passed and companies begin to act on the frameworks that they've proposed. Following attacks on SolarWinds and JBS this year in particular, companies are now far more alert to the consequences of insecure software in the supply chain. And as one of the first pieces of legislation to require a software bill of materials, we anticipate the results of the consultations over Joe Biden's executive order will have a GDPR-like effect on the market, where those recommendations and practices will form the basis for legislation or business practices around the world. We expect that the main beneficiaries of this trend will be a range of software as a service companies, both those providing the ability to monitor supply chains and find alternatives in the event of failure of suppliers, and those that can supply their own software in line with those new compliance requirements. We discussed several of these opportunities in our fleet tracking research. In particular, AI and blockchain-based companies will have strong success in this area, as these technologies can provide particular benefits that enhance supply chain security. By making records unalterable and able to react ahead of major problems in the supply chain, these companies can guarantee that they can continue to sell their products and make sure that their suppliers remain stable. We also expect that supply chain cybersecurity will emerge as a prominent feature for many industries next year, beyond those that have been traditionally aware of those sorts of needs. This includes diverse industries from healthcare to food processing, which have suffered thanks to supply chain insecurities. We also anticipate that supply chain software companies will be asked to provide predictive models and alternative problem-solving tools for supply chain disruption as part of their product offerings. We also expect a variety of malware detection models based on AI that examines software components, and those interactions between software components will also begin to appear in greater numbers. There is software out there that already does this, but it's only provided by a limited number of vendors. We also anticipate that the US Software Bill of Materials Executive Order will generate a de facto standard for supply chain cybersecurity in the same way that GDPR has become a global standard for personal data protection. And we're now moving on to our top trend for 2022. That is that consumer data platforms will increase customer satisfaction. Customer data platforms, or CDPs, are a kind of software that combines data from multiple sources to provide advanced insight into consumer preferences. And this is typically done as part of messaging platforms in the way that we're talking about it today. These will enable brands and enterprises that wish to deliver messages to deliver a better customer experience by collecting increasing amounts of relevant data on customer preferences, which can then be passed to enterprises, and they can then benefit from greater insight into their customers. And so what do we expect from this? We expect that this increasing usage of these platforms will create a differentiation point amongst those competitors who do not use CDPs. As communication channels become increasingly IP-based and media-rich, CDP data platforms will become increasingly important as the ability to target particular things to particular consumers becomes more possible. The progression from multi-channel to omni-channel communications will also be a key driver of this market, with the ability to manage customer data across a range of communication channels as a key selling point for CPaaS platforms, that's communication platforms as a service, that offer CDPs as part of their offering. This is a way to seek a return on investment into these platforms through the integration of customer loyalty schemes that can generate upselling opportunities and minimize the cost of onboarding new customers. In recent years, there's been a change in the way that people shop, with a shift to e-commerce and then to m-commerce, as evidenced by the success of vendors like Amazon and Alibaba. And alongside this has been a shift in consumer expectations. With a wide range of choice for the customer and an omni-channel approach to buying, this has brought an expectation that loyalty rewards should be simple to accrue and offer tailored benefits to the individual, and thereby motivating consumers to earn them more frequently. And these are all benefits that CDPs can provide. So why will this happen in 2022? Twilio's acquisition of Segment and Link Mobility's acquisition of Marketing Platform are examples of some of the earliest movement within this particular space. Over 2022, we expect these movements to be emulated either through acquisitions or via in-house developments of CDP services, with the end goal of providing brands and enterprises with a greater insight into consumer behavior. With several CPaaS vendors already investing in this, we expect others in the space to follow suit and to ensure that they can support these services and keep up with the competition. However, the biggest issue with these platforms will be the collection and storage of customer data by a third party at this point. Regulatory adherence to this will be a key area of focus for the next year, as far as we expect, as CDPs are increasingly used by communications platforms. Over the next year, we also expect consumers to become increasingly aware of the data being collected on them by third parties. CDPs will need to convince consumers that their data is safe, as well as defend their practices in the light of existing legislation. Who are the key beneficiaries here? Firstly, brands and enterprises will be the main beneficiaries, the people who use these services and engage with the end users. The acquisition of customer data platforms and the inclusion of this within CPaaS will enhance a platform's ability to better understand end users and generate more traffic for the brand that the end user is interacting with. In turn, this creates a more valuable service for the platforms, which with the aim of attracting the higher spending brands to the CPaaS services. The biggest beneficiary will be those closely aligned with advertising and marketing, as they have similar approaches to the level of customer insight within those industries, and that greater level of insight enables ad networks to better target users with advertising. We expect a similar approach for CDPs, which will enable CPaaS platforms to understand when to contact consumers, over which channels they prefer to be contacted, and most importantly, what content of messages drives the most engagement. The next step for these CDPs will be increasing their values to the brands or enterprises that they engage with, which will be done by providing the CDP with an increasing amount of data sources. However, as previously mentioned, this raises issues with data protection and GDPR. At this point, CDPs will collect identifiable information such as names, demographics, locations, and social information. And however, this anonymizing this data is likely to be the most straightforward way to ensure data protection and relatively simple to achieve. In fact, this is the primary distinction between a CDP and a CRM at this point. That's a customer relationship management platform. A CRM will collect identifiable information, whereas a CDP will only report on anonymous visitors. Additionally, CDPs are able to track offline activities and can analyze large data sector activities to generate more granular insights. At present, the majority of traffic for these sorts of messages is delivered by SMS. Our most recent CPaaS research estimates that SMS represents about 95% of the messaging market value. However, by 2026, our research predicts that SMS will only represent 70%. As rich media messaging becomes more integral to mobile communications, the value of these CDPs will increase as brands and enterprises can do more with native messaging clients. That wraps up our top 10 tech trends and predictions for 2022. Let's have a quick recap of the rankings. Number 10 is that 5G capabilities will drive private network adoption. This is a key technology for several industry use cases, but will be of limited use outside of those. Video game subscriptions consolidating, the industry is number 9. We anticipate these platforms going the way of video streaming services, with publishers siloing content away in order to retain subscribers and restrict what their competitors can do. Number 8 is that streaming platforms will capitalize on the rise of eSports. As these rise in popularity, there will be an increase in revenues headed to these platforms, and the market isn't big enough yet to attract the interest of major broadcasters to bid for the content. Smart grids accelerating. Environmental concerns highlighted by COP26 have brought more of these initiatives to the fore, making 2022 the start of a longer-term acceleration of smart grid deployment. This is followed by edge computing driving new healthcare applications at number 6. Increasing edge computing capabilities paired with the sensitive nature of healthcare data will drive new applications to the edge, as well as some hospitals using it for the purposes of automation, robotics, and more advanced capabilities. Electric vehicle charging interoperability is next up at number 5. With several initiatives already underway in this area, 2022 will be the year that these come out of the pilot phase and into the mainstream. Flash calling's impact on the business messaging market is number 4. Operators need to develop solutions in this area or risk losing revenue to this new trend. Number 3 is how 5G and IoT roaming will disrupt the existing roaming market. The need for data roaming rather than voice and SMS will mean that new services need to develop to cover these needs. Our penultimate trend is that supply chains will adopt technologies and practices to increase their resilience. Legislative moves in this area, as well as clear threats from supply chain disruption and cyber attacks, will drive business concern and spending in this particular area, and this will start happening in 2022 as calendar year budgets refresh and spending can be updated to reflect those new concerns. Finally, our number 1 trend is that customer data platforms will be leveraged to increase consumer satisfaction. The increasing use of media-rich messaging will allow messaging service providers to leverage these services to provide a better experience for customers. So that brings us to the end of our webinar for the top 10 tech trends in 2022. I hope that you found it insightful. We will make a recording of this available on our YouTube channel and on the Juniper Research website, following which we will publish a more in-depth white paper analysing and breaking down these trends a little bit more. Once again, please download the related reports from our website, and if you have any further, if you need any further assistance, you can contact us directly on the contact details provided here. Once again, thank you all for joining, and goodbye for now.